Thank you very much. Well, quite a change of pace, I'm going to say to you now. It's strange, isn't it, that when a specific word enters your consciousness, you hear it and you see it everywhere. After I'd been asked to present here today, I suddenly became very aware of the number of times and the contexts in which the word hope is used in our daily discourse. Whether we hear somebody express hope for peace in some part of our troubled world, or hope for a person's recovery, or hope for some sporting success. Sorry, New South Wales. As a former Queenslander, I can say that. The word hope appears as a constant refrain in our daily life. However, one of the more bizarre examples of the use of the word that I came across in recent time, and I have to share it with you. Did you know that you can actually buy hope in a jar in the cosmetic section of our large department stores? So Glency, that's all you've got to do is just rub it on, right? And you don't have to worry about anything else. And I can also tell you, at this same department store, if hope in a jar fails, you can actually purchase miracle in a jar. It's that easy. However, more relevantly for today's discussion is to start from the premise that hope is a fundamental life-affirming force. I like to believe that we're all born with this tiny seed of hope as part of our emotional DNA, but we have to nurture it. Whatever, hope is necessary, as we know, to sustain and support us. It gives us emotional resilience to cope with the downsides that life throws at each and every one of us. It's essential to our overall emotional and physical well-being and survival. And if you don't have hope as part of your emotional armoury, then the likelihood is that you will succumb to the despair that so often leads to suicide. Now, adolescence and youth is a difficult time in any person's life. The well-known saying that, youth is wasted on the young, that we should all actually, I'd love to be young again knowing what I know now. But in any event, it is a very difficult time. There are significant emotional and physical challenges that have to be dealt with. It is a time when hope as a belief in oneself and what positives that life has to offer is required in abundance, because that is the time when the young person will most be tested. Now, speaking from the perspective of government in developing a nurturing hope in our young people, and that's what we're trying to talk about here today. How do we nurture and develop hope? I believe we have to start, like all things, by identifying the circumstances that cause a young person to lose hope. Because I also believe before you can treat a problem, it helps to understand the causes. So by and large, and many of these are all well known, but they bear repeating, the causal factors that often give rise to loss of hope in the young are, not exhaustively, socioeconomic circumstances, including factors such as homelessness, little if any educational opportunities, with consequent poor employment prospects, dysfunctional family environments involving violence, abuse, and or neglect, and that can be either sexual, physical, or emotional, drug and alcohol abuse, sexuality, peer or parental pressure, bullying either directly or via social media. And social media has its good and its bad sides, and I know there's been some recent discussion about using social media not as a haven for bullies, as it so often is, but as a way of providing online mentoring to young people in this digital age. And cultural or racial discrimination can be another factor. Now, many of those factors that I've just referred to, and you would be familiar with most of them, I'm sure, they cut across all income and social groups, many of them, as does youth suicide. As well, many of those factors have a cascading effect on a young person. That is, a socio-economic disadvantage in life, incorporating little, if any, educational opportunities and no job prospects will often tip a young person over into drug and alcohol abuse, precipitating a drug-induced psychosis which can well culminate in suicide. Or a young person becomes so emotionally damaged by the insidious effects of bullying or abuse that he or she spirals into depression and suicide. Now, what's the role of government in all of this? And that's the sphere of influence that I'm speaking from today. Some of the things I have mentioned are not what I would call directly amenable to government intervention. For example, how do you best address the destructive impact of bullying by young people, of their peers, via social media? I'll come back to that shortly. But the role of government, as we all know, is multifaceted. But a critical responsibility relevant to today's discussion is for governments to provide, in the very first instance, a social environment in which a young person is able to access the basic rights that are inherent in our social structure, so that he or she can grasp the opportunities that life presents in a way that is both meaningful and rewarding. And you know, for some groups in our community, those basic rights that I talk about can be as simple as clean running water, somewhere to live, you know, something to eat at the end of the day. This is not rocket science. I'm talking about those things that people need to sustain not only their physical but their emotional well-being. So a good place for governments to start in providing those basic rights is, of course, with the obvious: housing, education and employment. These are very critical factors for young people to have it. And in each of these, governments play a big part. Adequate social housing, diverse educational programs that covers the widest range of skills and knowledge for the purposes of facilitating employment opportunities. And the governments have to work with the private sector to create those opportunities. Now, those issues, housing, education, employment, they're really the building blocks that help not only young people, but the community generally to work and to have a framework that can be relied upon. But the role of government goes well beyond those, and to many of the other causal factors that I've already mentioned. For example, in the delivery of appropriate both mental health and drug and alcohol services for young people. Not only for young people, but particularly for young people, because if you can get to young people at that point in their life, when they have these problems, you can often sort of, as it were, prevent them cascading into adulthood with chronic problems. And that's very important. Getting prevention, as we all know, is much, much better than cure. And it's something that I strongly believe in, to get access to those services where they're required sooner rather than later. Things such as discrimination legislation on areas such as race, sexuality and so on. I don't know, I'm sure most of you here saw the TV coverage recently of the vote in Ireland for legalising same-sex marriage. And I thought it was quite lovely. There was a young female couple being interviewed by this reporter, and he turned to one of the young women, she looked about 17 or 18, and he said to her, "What does this mean to you?" And she said, "It means the world to me. It means that I'm now equal to everybody else." And I was struck by that she felt that this was such an important issue, and it was something that governments, you know, can only do to help that young person and many other young people, and others, of course, that have gone before. So governments have, as I said, not just the responsibility in the wider framework of jobs and education, and but also to look to those areas of social services to make sure that they are there. Now, but of course, the other big thing to me is that governments have overwhelmingly they have a leadership role in our community. It isn't just delivering the budget or delivering services in a, infinite demands and finite resources approach. They have a responsibility to foster a civil society, a society that is inclusive and tolerant of diversity, and a society that, above all, values its young and the future they represent. And I don't think we do that. I don't think we do value our young. There was a time when I grew up when it was said, young people should be seen and not heard. Well, fortunately, we've come a long way since then, but I still think we don't properly value our young. To foster hope in our young people, we have to nurture them. And one of the most important ways we do that is to provide with young people with a solid foundation of security, love, support, and the opportunity to be listened to when they need it. Much of that is found in the first instance within the wider family unit of a young person. But so often, of course, that essential foundation is lacking. A person's family unit and close friends are the most significant sphere of influence in a young person's life. It is within and to that sphere of influence that a young person will so often turn when the going gets tough. Now, if the support and the help is not there in a functional and in a supportive way, the young person will so often flounder and may well suicide as a result. Now, the role of government outside of the family sphere of influence is to provide young people with access to services to ensure that they have someone to talk to when they need it most for support and guidance. And that someone has to be someone who has their best interests at heart and is able to provide the necessary support at that time. And of course, at the moment, I believe that services exist in a limited way. But it goes wider than that even further, because each and every one of us, to a greater or lesser degree, is part of a family unit. Are we not? So the onus is on all of us to encourage, to support, and to listen to young people. In other words, we have to become ambassadors for hope. We have to foster hope in young people within our own personal sphere of influence. But we also have a wider role. We have to lobby governments to play its part, to provide the services that are necessary and to provide support where it is most needed. Now, that's a very slow process. You don't achieve these changes in society, apart from the technology that's already been well canvassed, easily. If you want to persuade governments to provide services, you have to adopt what I call the slow drip effect of life. That is, you just keep at it and at it and at it. And if you want to see examples of where that has happened, if you think back about trying to educate the community and governments about things like smoking, even more recently, domestic violence. Finally, now domestic violence has been with us for years, but finally we're starting to see that it's getting some prominence in the way in which governments provide services. And if we and every one of us as ambassadors for hope want to provide better services for the young, want to be able to provide the services that they need to keep that hope alive, to push on through the difficult times, then you've got to keep lobbying. And you've got to keep reminding the community that it's important. And you don't achieve those results overnight. I've learnt when I used to negotiate with governments that apart from having to, if you wanted them to even listen, you have to first of all show them that what you wanted was cost neutral. They always wanted to know how much is it going to cost when you wanted to ask something. And secondly, what's in it for me? So you had to persuade them that it was a good news story for them, and that you could also persuade them in some way that there was this cost-benefit analysis that would look good. Beyond that, it's a question of education, is it not? You've got to continue to educate the community about the importance of providing the services that are so essential to our young people. So finally, of course, let me say this: adolescence, and as I said, youth in today's age of such rapid technological change is not for the faint-hearted. But as George Bernard Shaw said in the rest of that somewhat well-known statement, "Take courage, my child, it can be delightful." The role of government, however, at this crucial time in a person's life is to do all it can, not only to provide services, but to reinforce by its words and its actions to every young person that their life does have real value, not just to them, but to us all. Thank you.